This is a story you need to hear, especially if life's ever made you feel like the deck is stacked against you. It's about resilience, about defying odds that no one could imagine, and about finding hope in the unlikeliest of places. The man who survived 2 atomic bombs, Tsutomu Yamaguchi. The morning before the sky fell. Imagine waking up, pouring yourself a cup of tea, and heading off to work, thinking it's just another ordinary day. Now hold on to that thought, because for one man, what started as an ordinary day would end in the unthinkable. Twice. Let me introduce you to Tsutomu Yamaguchi, a man whose story is equal parts awe-inspiring, tragic, and, believe it or not, laced with a quiet resilience that might even make you smile. Yamaguchi wasn't just a survivor, he was a symbol of humanity's will to endure against all odds. Let's rewind the clock to August 6, 1945. It was a warm morning in Hiroshima, and Yamaguchi, a 29-year-old naval engineer, was on a business trip. You know the kind. Tight schedules, endless meetings, and just enough time to think, what's for lunch? He was scheduled to return home to Nagasaki that very day. But as fate would have it, his departure was delayed. Why? Oh, nothing major. He'd just misplaced his travel papers. Classic Yamaguchi. A small oversight that would inadvertently place him at the epicenter of one of history's most devastating events. Around 8:15 a.m., the world changed. A blinding flash lit up the sky, brighter than 1,000 suns, and in an instant, Hiroshima became the testing ground for the atomic age. Yamaguchi, standing less than 3 kilometers from ground zero, was hurled into the air by the sheer force of the explosion. Now, at this point, you might be wondering, how does someone even begin to survive something like that? Well, Yamaguchi had 2 things going for him: luck and a trench coat. Yes, you heard me right. A trench coat. It shielded much of his torso from the worst of the heat blast, though his exposed face and arms weren't so fortunate. He stumbled through the chaos, dazed and injured, making his way to a bomb shelter for the night. But here's where the story takes a twist. Despite his injuries, Yamaguchi was determined to return home to Nagasaki the very next day. Why? Because, as he later said, he didn't want to inconvenience his boss. Talk about dedication, huh? Arriving in Nagasaki, bandaged and burnt, Yamaguchi reported to work on August 9th. He was explaining the devastation he'd witnessed in Hiroshima when, as if scripted by some cruel cosmic playwright, the second atomic bomb detonated over Nagasaki. We'll pause here for a moment, because if you're thinking, this can't possibly get any stranger, oh, just wait. Yamaguchi's story is only just beginning. The second sunrise. Tsutomu Yamaguchi, bandaged and burnt, standing in his Nagasaki office, trying to explain the unexplainable. Imagine the scene. Yamaguchi recounting the horrors of Hiroshima to his stunned colleagues, his voice hoarse and cracking. Then suddenly, a familiar flash fills the sky. It was 11:02 a.m. on August 9, 1945, when the second atomic bomb exploded over Nagasaki. This time, Yamaguchi was about 3 kilometers from the epicenter. Close enough to experience the blast again, but far enough to survive again. Now, you might think surviving 1 atomic bomb is improbable enough, but 2? By this point, Yamaguchi was probably wondering if he'd accidentally offended a celestial deity. But true to his resilient nature, he lived through the chaos yet again. Here's the wild part. Despite being thrown to the ground and suffering further injuries, Yamaguchi made his way home to check on his wife and infant son. And by some miracle, if we can even call anything in this story that, they were alive. His wife had been out running errands near a concrete structure, which shielded her from the worst of the blast. That evening, as the family huddled together, surrounded by devastation, Yamaguchi's wife must have been thinking, "This is it. We've survived 2 atomic bombs. What more could possibly happen?" But here's where Yamaguchi's resolve truly shined. Instead of succumbing to despair, he focused on getting his family through the aftermath. The days that followed were a grim blur of pain, radiation sickness, and unimaginable loss. Yamaguchi was gravely ill, his wounds festering, his body weakened by exposure to radiation not once but twice. Yet somehow he pressed on. Tsutomu Yamaguchi didn't just survive, he lived. Now, before we move on to the quieter years that followed, let's pause for a moment to reflect. How does someone endure this level of tragedy and come out the other side not bitter, but hopeful? Perhaps Yamaguchi himself gave us the best answer. Years later, when asked how he managed to keep going, he simply said, "Having experienced both bombings, I have no hatred for America. The reason I hate the atomic bomb is because of what it does to humanity." But I digress. Where were we? Oh yes, Nagasaki in ruins, but life continuing nonetheless. Rising from the ashes. Nagasaki lay in ruins. The air was thick with smoke and despair. But for Tsutomu Yamaguchi, life had one simple demand: keep moving forward. He focused on helping his family survive the immediate aftermath. Water was scarce, food even scarcer, and radiation sickness was a shadow that followed him everywhere. Despite his injuries, Yamaguchi returned to his job as an engineer within weeks of the second bombing. Yes, you heard that right. Weeks. He was still wrapped in bandages, his body weakened, but the man had bills to pay. Imagine telling your boss, "Sorry, I can't come in today. I survived 2 atomic bombs." You'd think that'd earn you a lifetime pass, but not for Yamaguchi. For the next few years, life was a delicate balancing act. The long-term effects of radiation took their toll: hair loss, nausea, and a deep fatigue that never quite left. But amidst the struggles, Yamaguchi found moments of joy. He watched his children grow up, he cultivated a quiet strength, and he carried on. And here's where Yamaguchi's story takes an unexpected turn. For decades, he rarely spoke about his experiences. In Japan, survivors of the atomic bombings, known as hibakusha, often faced stigma. Many kept their stories to themselves, quietly enduring their pain. Yamaguchi was no different, until he wasn't. In the later years of his life, Yamaguchi became a vocal advocate for nuclear disarmament. His transformation into a messenger of peace began in earnest in the 1950s and 60s, as the world edged closer to the brink of nuclear war. He started sharing his story, not out of anger, but out of hope. Yamaguchi wanted people to understand the true cost of war, the human toll that no statistic could capture. He spoke at conferences, wrote essays, and even appeared in a documentary about the bombings. When asked why he chose to relive his trauma so publicly, Yamaguchi said, "I speak out because I feel it is my duty as someone who survived." And speak he did, calmly, thoughtfully, and with the kind of perspective that only comes from living through history's darkest chapters. But here's what makes Yamaguchi's advocacy so remarkable. He never allowed bitterness to consume him. He directed his energy not at blame, but at building a future where no one else would have to endure what he did. Oh, and let me share a detail that's both heartbreaking and a little funny in a dark way. In 2009, at the age of 93, Yamaguchi was officially recognized by the Japanese government as the only person to have survived both bombings. His reaction? The recognition brings mixed feelings. It's not something I'm particularly happy about. But I digress. Ah yes, Yamaguchi's legacy. A legacy of resilience and hope. By the time Tsutomu Yamaguchi passed away in 2010 at the age of 93, he had lived a life that defied the odds in every sense. And while surviving 2 atomic bombings is what etched his name into history, it's what he did with that survival that truly defines his legacy. Yamaguchi spent his later years as a soft-spoken yet powerful advocate for nuclear disarmament. His speeches weren't fiery or confrontational. Instead, they were deeply human. He didn't wield anger as his weapon. He wielded empathy. He spoke not just for himself, but for all the victims of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, for those who couldn't tell their stories. One of Yamaguchi's most poignant messages was his belief in the potential for peace. The only way to guarantee the world will never again witness the horrors of nuclear war, he said, is to eliminate the weapons themselves. He saw firsthand how the devastating power of atomic bombs could erase entire cities, and yet he held on to hope that humanity could learn from its mistakes. And here's a moment that will stick with you. In one of his final interviews, Yamaguchi reflected on his survival. "I was given 2 lives," he said, "and I have lived them both to the fullest." Imagine the depth of gratitude in that statement. He wasn't just a man who endured tragedy, he was a man who chose to find meaning in it. But let's not pretend Yamaguchi's life was all speeches and solemn reflections. He was, at heart, a family man. He found joy in the little things, spending time with his wife, Hisako, and watching his children and grandchildren grow up. In many ways, his life after the bombings was a quiet rebellion against the destruction he'd witnessed. He rebuilt, he loved, he lived. Today, Tsutomu Yamaguchi stands as a symbol of resilience and the human spirit's capacity to endure. His story is taught in classrooms, shared in documentaries, and remembered by peace activists around the globe. And maybe that's the most powerful thing about Yamaguchi's legacy. It's not just a story of survival, it's a story of choices. Faced with unimaginable loss, Yamaguchi chose not to let anger define him. He chose to heal, to advocate, to build a better world for the generations that followed. So the next time you find yourself overwhelmed by life's challenges, think of Tsutomu Yamaguchi. If one man could survive 2 atomic bombings, rebuild his life, and spend his final years spreading a message of hope, maybe, just maybe, we can all find a little extra strength within ourselves. And that, my friends, is the story of the man who survived the unthinkable, not once but twice.